Victor Lubasek, I think. Again, Victor, sorry, it's just barely visible in gray here. Is coming in and he asked for this one. He says, I live in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and after I heard the news of the stabbing at the Crossroads Mall, I had an instinct that the perpetrator was a Somali refugee. Of course, after some time the news came out, affirming that intuition. I talked with some friends and co-workers, and they hesitantly admitted that they thought the same. Why should I be shamed for having an instinct as long as it does not lead to irrational violence? This is extremely well put. Well, I got to think about this for 1 second here. The word prejudice means to prejudge something. Prejudge something. And so when you apply, that's actually not bad. It means to prejudge something. So if you prejudge a group of people, then you are actually, I think, doing something immoral, because there are many people in that group who are not guilty or not displaying the trait that you either find good or bad. If you say that a group is a criminal group, if you say that these crime rates are whatever they are because of a particular ethnic group or national origin or anything like that, then you are in fact harming the people who are in that group who did not commit any of these acts. Most of this, virtually all the Somalis in Minnesota didn't go and stab people in the mall. But it doesn't mean that you cannot recognize a pattern. It doesn't mean that you can't have the common sense and the just plain willingness to understand the pattern. And the pattern is that every time somebody is getting stabbed or blown up, somebody's shouting Allahu Akbar. And it doesn't matter if it happens in San Bernardino or in Minnesota or in Orlando or in Brussels or in Paris or in Moscow. It doesn't matter if it's happening anywhere. If some group of people are being murdered, certainly with having their head sawed off, and somebody screaming Allahu Akbar. And of course, the shameful example that disproves the case is American mass shootings, which they don't scream Allahu Akbar, which is an entirely different subject, which I would like to get to someday very soon. But in any event, when you hear that somebody was randomly stabbed at the mall, or you hear that there's been an explosion in what was the town? Was it Nice, in south of France, where the guy plowed through with a truck? Your first instinct is to think, I'll bet it's Muslims, and you've been told to be ashamed of it, and so on. This is a piece of fine, higher grade thinking. It's the opposite of sophistry. It's the opposite of me arguing what the definition of is. So listen carefully, please. I can say that if there's a terror attack in the country, I would naturally think that it was Muslims, because there's overwhelming evidence that most of these type of attacks historically have been Muslim. It doesn't mean that it has to be a Muslim, and it doesn't mean that every Muslim is guilty of it, but it does mean that if you live in a world where terror attacks are being conducted virtually exclusively by Muslims, if I see the sign of it looks like a terror attack, and I think Muslim, that's not prejudice. That's not racism. It's nothing. It's just using your brain. It's just the kind of things that we deal with every day in the world. The black crime rate in this country is enormous. The black murder rates in black neighborhoods are 50, 60,000, 50,000. Let's say 50 people per 100,000. 50 people per 100,000 in Detroit, round numbers. In Plano, Texas, it's half a person per 100,000. 50 people per 100,000 in Detroit, 1 person in 200,000 in Plano, Texas. It's 100 to 1, virtually. And that's not prejudice, and that's not racism. That is the reality of the world as it exists. And if 13% of the population commits 65% of the violent crimes, then I didn't cause that. And for me to pretend that's not true is lunacy. But this is where we get to the core of the issue. But that doesn't give me the right to say that black person who I don't know is a criminal, because that's just wrong. It's morally wrong. It's a fine line, but you can walk it, and you can walk it with integrity and honor. You can say, look, I understand that we're generalizing about a group, and I understand that when you generalize about a group, you do harm to people in that group who are not guilty of whatever you're accusing them of. I understand that. But at the same time, see, I can keep two thoughts in my head at the same time. At the same time, I can recognize patterns when I see them, right? I mean, you can recognize a pattern. It's pretty clear. So yes, of course, it's a kind of a moral dilemma. But I'm not going to be demonized for saying what seems to me to be obvious if it turns out that a religion that commands its adherents to murder everybody else, not just some people, but everybody who's not them, go out and kill them. If that's what it says in their religious book, I'm not going to be surprised if it turns out that people doing a lot of killing are of that Islamic persuasion. And again, we deal with moral issues here. I try to anyway. I try to do moral issues, and I try to live a moral life. And so I ask myself, what about all of the innocent Muslims who really have nothing to do with this, who are good tax-paying American citizens and family people and all the rest of it? What about them? What did they do to deserve this enormously rapidly growing anti-Muslim attitude in this country, which is reasonable? It's reasonable to have an attitude against a group or any kind of immigrants of any color if their entire philosophy of life is the absolute antithesis of everything we believe in. That's not prejudice. That's absolutely reasonable. But what about the innocent Muslims? What did they do? And I think that the answer to that is this: is that they didn't stand up. They did not have the courage or secretly agreed with these people. And instead of saying, well, it's not fair to blame all Muslims, none of them have stood up and said, we're Americans first. We love this country, and where are they? Why are they not turning these people in? If these Muslims in America have all these terror networks and all these mosques are preaching all this stuff, how come perfectly good, decent Muslims aren't saying, well, there's this meeting here going on that you might want to look at? And I thought for a long time it was moral cowardice on the part of the American Muslims, but it's not. It's also survival on their part, because if they make that call and it's found out, then these Muslims will kill them. They will kill them first because they've betrayed their religion. So what it really comes down to is the reason that American Muslims are not demonstrating, and the reason against ISIS and terror, and the reason they're not turning them in, is because they have no confidence that by doing so we are serious. If the President of the United States is on the side of ISIS and constantly talks about how wonderful Islam is, why should they take that risk? Why? Who's going to defend them? The government? Government's telling you, no, you're imagining the whole thing. It's not fair to say that all of these terrorist bombings where everybody's screaming Allahu Akbar have anything to do with Islam. So why would they stand up? If the President of the United States doesn't have the moral clarity to say it, then why should they? It's a perfectly reasonable argument. Why should they stand up and say that as a Muslim I find this appalling, awful, disgraceful, and just awful, and I'd like to apologize? Why don't they say it? Well, they don't say it because the President of the United States tells them it's not Islam. No, this is not. No. Islam is a part of, and on and on and on and on. This man is such a catastrophe. It's just such a catastrophe. And you know, after 8 years of catastrophe, what has he got to show for it? The world is in much worse shape internationally in terms of our foreign relations. The economy's been about to recover for 8 years now. What is his signature legislation? Obamacare. It's falling apart. They're going out of business. It's literally falling apart. We didn't have to banish it. We spent how many years did we spend in the Tea Party trying to get Obamacare repealed? We didn't have to get it repealed. It turns out that we didn't have to get it repealed because we said it doesn't make any sense economically, and it doesn't make any sense economically, so we don't have to repeal it because it's destroying, it's collapsing under the weight of reality. This guy, when it's all over, is going to look back, and what's going to be his legacy? What will he point to? Was there any legislation? No. Did he win a world war or something for us? No. A Cold War? No. Did he make us stronger? No. What did he do? Well, the one thing he did more than anything that should damn him throughout the rest of history is he took a country that was very nearly a colorblind society, very nearly out of the woods, and in order to gain political power for himself and his party, basically invented this Black Lives Matter argument that black people are being assassinated in large numbers by policemen and white people on the streets of America. He did it intentionally. He's reopened the oldest and deepest wound that we have in this country, and he's done it for his own political gain and for that of his party. That's going to send him to hell as far as I'm concerned, because that's not innocent. That's not a mistake. That's a strategy. Gin up a race war among American citizens, because if we don't get 90% of the black vote, then we lose. That's a definition of evil to me, the definition of it. Anyway, so yeah, look, you cannot. I remember one other thing I wanted to say about this. I haven't talked about this in quite a long time. So somebody gets stabbed in a mall. You live in Minnesota, where there are large numbers of Somali immigrants, and your first thought is, I'll bet it was a Somali. And it turns out it was. And therefore, should I feel guilty about all this? I'm not a real super expert at this, but that doesn't mean I won't talk about it like I am for a while. But this is something I haven't talked about in a long time. It's really, really interesting. And it's got to do with heuristics. In 2001, back on my wall back there, the HAL 9000 computer was a heuristically programmed, I want to say analog computer. So what's a heuristic? Well, heuristics, as I understand it, is simple and fascinating. Heuristics means that you don't have to learn everything every single time. That once you learn something, that is a building block that you can consider to be standard. My God, listen, somebody's burglar moving. There's a burglar moving right behind me. I guess he's got all our hard drives, and he certainly has our technical skill, that's for sure, because God knows we can't get a show on the air without having a mic fail. But back to heuristics. So a heuristic is a building block, and the simpler the heuristic is, the more reliable it is. So if you see something that's glowing red on a countertop and you touch it and you burn yourself, you've touched a hot stove, and you won't do that again. You don't have to keep touching the stove to find out that glowing red things burn. You don't have to. Every time you see something hot, every time you see fire, someplace, any place, you don't have to stick your hand in it every single time to know that it's hot and it's going to burn you. Because once you learn it once, it's there. And so heuristics are these beliefs and understandings and rules and laws that you can think of as a series of bricks, and we build our worldview out of these heuristics, out of these lessons. And to some degree, they're an assumption. They are an assumption. You know, if you see a red hot thing, you burn your hand, you go someplace and red hot thing, it's almost certainly going to be a glowing hot piece of metal or something, but maybe not. But most of the time, it works great. So the more simple your heuristics is, like glowing red burn, that's a simple heuristic that's going to do you well. When you get up into higher level heuristics, Democrats are traitors, that's not reliable. You can get there, but it's not reliable. So the question is, when we start asking ourselves about how we get into these situations and what's fair and what's not fair, is what heuristics, what building blocks, little building blocks of truth have we inserted into our philosophy that work most of the time, and sometimes they work virtually all of the time, but not necessarily all the time. And somewhere along here, we have seen enough heuristically programmed algorithm computer, anyway, whatever. We have seen enough evidence to convince us that Muslims are at war with the West. We've seen enough evidence. I watched it on TV. I watched these guys fly jet airplanes full of people into buildings. I watched it on TV. I didn't have to be convinced about it, and I didn't have to have anybody explain it to me. I knew exactly what was going on. And I know, and you know, we both know, all of us know, that on the 4 jets that were hijacked that day, we know what the last words spoken on all 4 of those jets were before those people were atomized. We know. We know what the last 2 words were on every single one of those 4 jets, don't we? We know what they are. And if you don't see that, there's something wrong with you. If you can't see that, if you cannot see that the exact last instant before those 2 jets went into the World Trade Center, before that 1 jet went into the Pentagon, and before that other jet was forced into a field by the heroes on board, if you don't understand that the last 2 words that existed among all of those lies were Allahu Akbar, if you don't understand that, then there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. You're missing something. You're trying to show people you're so noble and so good by denying obvious reality. That's not virtue. That's mental illness. You need some help. You need some psychiatric help. So when we see things like 9/11, it becomes a lesson. It becomes a heuristic, which is started out for us. Look, we didn't pay much attention to Muslims because Americans, frankly, don't pay much attention to anything that's not going on in America. We don't care. I told you about that classic argument I got into with this German guy. So before I started doing what I was doing, it was a flame war in a chat group, and this German guy was for an hour and a half talking about how awful Americans are, how fat they are, how stupid they are, how awful they are, blah 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 blah, on and on and on and on and on. And I finally said, well, you know what? We've been talking for an hour now about what you Germans think about Americans. You want to know what we Americans think about you Germans? And he said, yes. I said, we don't. We don't think about you. We don't think about you at all. We don't know who your movie stars are. We don't know who your music is. We don't wear your T-shirts. We don't care. And that's devastating. And I saw what I saw. And you saw what you saw. And to pretend that didn't happen is to deny reality. I never forget the images of those people falling, you know, of the people falling down the World Trade Center, which I think I pointed out in that post I did on 9/11 last week. The pictures of the people falling from the World Trade Center it's almost like it's laid out by a graphic designer, because the vertical lines of the structure of the World Trade Center almost look like the kind of thing that a graphic designer would put in there to accentuate the distance and the acceleration, the velocity, all of it. It's just the image is so, well, I'm just going to use the word. It's such a perfect image. Falling man, the one person who they've got that relative close-up on, who's going down head first and seems completely at ease. He just looks like he's like walking in the park. They did a great documentary on Falling Man. I found out who that guy was, by the way. But you see that picture, and that's all you need to know about that day, right? That's all you need to know about that day. The explosions are spectacular, and they're very eye-catching, and all the orange fireballs and all the debris and all of that. But that's not what happened that day. What happened that day is that man falling through the air head first with these vertical lines, and it looks like somebody put it together in Photoshop, and you paid a lot of money for it. It's an image that is virtually perfect, because that image captures the horror of 9/11 more than anything else. The reason that 9/11 was so appalling in New York City, especially, in fact, exclusively, because this doesn't apply to the people in Shanksville, I don't think, quite as much, or the Pentagon. Yes, the people on board the planes knew they were in trouble. Yes, they knew they were going to die. Well, ones on the first one didn't know they were going to die. In fact, the only people who knew they were going to die were on Flight 93, and that's why Flight 93 didn't hit their targets. If everybody on those 4 airplanes knew what was going to happen to them, none of them would have hit their targets. American citizens would have done the same thing to those other 3 that they did on Flight 93. They would have gotten in there and broken up the door, and they would have tried to get this guys out and then put the plane on the ground or save it, one or the other. In any event, the horror of 9/11 is that, well, people were killed during the explosions. No question that people were killed during the explosions, large numbers of people. The people below the explosions more or less got out. And the horror of 9/11 is the fact that the people above the explosions were alive for 40 minutes at least, almost an hour in the case of the North Tower, that they had plenty of time to think about what was happening and that they were going to die. They knew they were going to die. And that's what's horrible about it. It's what's horrible about it is if you don't have enough imagination to be able to see that this wall that used to be there is now a giant gaping hole. You ever been to the top of the Empire State Building or top of a really tall building and understood how windy it is up there? And both of those towers form a venturi, so the air is being accelerated between those 2 buildings. You've got a solid wall that you've leaned against, that you've got your coffee pot against, and you got your pictures of your family, and the wall's just not there anymore. You ever look over out the window of a tall building, or lean over a railing on a tall building and get that sense of falling? Well, there's no railing there, and there's no window there. There's just a hole there, and wind is blowing past. And you see these people at the edge of these windows? Think about that. There's no handrail. There's no safety net. There's no ropes. There's nothing. I'm standing at a hole, and I am 80 stories above the ground, and there's this gaping hole in front of me, and fires behind me, and people screaming, and for 45 minutes, I have to sit there and decide, now what do I do? So, yeah, I didn't forget that, and I'm not going to forget it. And I don't care what people say about me. You can't convince me that didn't happen. And you can't convince me that the Germans didn't kill 6 million Jews and 6 million other people, including other Germans, in the death camps in World War II. I won't be convinced of that because it happened. It's not up for discussion. It happened. So, if you can't get your mind around it, that's your problem. But it happened, and I'm not going to let those people who were murdered, either in any of those situations, be forgotten by trying to exonerate their murderers and say that it's a religion of peace. It's not a religion of peace. It's not. There are many peaceful Muslims, but they're apostates. I think this is the last one.